Hello, everybody. My name is Letty Rising, and here I am giving another webinar in our series of webinars on formative assessment. And today's webinar is going to be on the topic of providing effective, detailed, and actionable feedback as a way of formative assessment. So this is a really important aspect of formative assessment, and there is definitely a little bit of an art to it as well. So we're going to talk about some different ways that we can give feedback in a way that it will be well received, and we're going to talk about what is feedback. We're going to talk about why it's important. I'm going to give some examples of feedback. We're going to talk about keys to effective feedback, how to give actionable feedback, and how we can present it carefully, improving feedback practices in your classroom, making peer feedback effective, and sample rubric questions, as well as ineffective feedback that you're going to want to avoid. So let's start with the idea or the concept of feedback in general. So what is feedback? Feedback is information about how we are doing in our efforts to reach our goal. In a classroom setting, feedback is the information provided by a teacher or a peer or a book or a computer program or an experience about some aspect of a student's performance or understanding. Students then use that feedback to confirm, improve upon, or restructure their existing knowledge and skills. So feedback is happening all the time, and it causes us to adjust our approach or adjust our understanding, and to, just to take information in and to synthesize it and integrate it into our existing information. So an example of feedback, and there's feedback happening all the time, if you give a lesson to the children give you feedback. They might be very engaged and excited about what you are talking about. Their eyes are staring at you. They're completely focused on you. That's feedback. Another kind of feedback is if you're giving a lesson and the children are, looking around everywhere, or they're like this and their eyes are glazed over and they're just, not looking very excited. That's another example of feedback as well. If you are even, telling a joke, if you tell a joke and people laugh, then that's feedback that your joke was funny. If you tell a joke and nobody laughs, that is also important feedback, letting you know that it is not being well received, and then you need to adjust your approach, right? Because if you're telling jokes and your goal is to be funny, you're going to need to adjust your approach in order to do so. And so the feedback of them not laughing is going to help you adjust your the way that you go about delivering your jokes in the future, or the content of your jokes, or whatever you're choosing, you're going to reflect and think about different ways you're going to adjust. And you will experiment around until you find a formula or some sort of a thing that works well for your situation. Telling students, good job, or, oh, this needs improvement, or this needs some work, is really a missed opportunity, because you really want to be specific with feedback. Feedback generally needs to be personal, and it needs to happen fast. So the best kind of feedback is happening in live time, in the moment. Maybe you're giving a lesson and the children are doing a follow-up with you, and they're at the table and you're noticing something, and you can give them feedback right then and there. That's the best, is when you can do it right then and there. You also want the feedback to be practical and relevant, and it should be done, during lessons or very soon after. You don't want to just rely on summative assessments, which is, we give the child a test, and then then we see what they learned from that test. And sometimes that can happen months later after a lesson was given. So we don't really necessarily have that immediate feedback so that we could reteach or teach something in a different way and try different strategies, because some summative assessments tell us how well somebody did, but they don't give us the information for future planning. So that's a really important thing to remember. So, if you're going to be giving feedback, you really need to do it within a couple of days, but again, right away or within the hour is ideal. Let's see here. And so feedback is a resource for students to take active steps to advance their own learning. So we are actually helping them become more independent and self-directed when we use the feedback process. So let's talk a little bit about why feedback is important. So studies have found that feedback is one of the most important teacher practices that we have in our teacher toolbox that will support the students' learning and improve the students' learning. I think that it's because it is a continuous loop. If you are doing ongoing feedback and you're able to kind of catch them when something happens and build upon it and talk about it, and there's a dialogue happening. So feedback improves student learning. Feedback also helps students understand where and how to improve. Because if you're just marking a piece of paper, a little check or an X, and they get 80% or 90%, they see the ones they got wrong, or they see where they have an error, but there's really not any information about what the error is, how they can improve that error, what are some alternatives that they could do instead of what they did in order for that error to occur. So feedback is where you can really give some very specific, concrete explanation on where and how the children can improve. Feedback is also important because it can really actually motivate students in making improvements. Because again, if they get a piece of paper back that has little marks all over it, or even if they don't have any marks over it, it says 100% perfect, yay, at the top. That doesn't really do much. The children don't feel really connected to you as the teacher or the experience of what's happening. But if you're giving them feedback and you're encouraging them and inspiring them with questions to grow beyond what they've done or to add more, to go deeper, that's going to be a very motivating process for the children. So it's really important for you to consider that. Another reason why feedback is important is that it can lead to increased understanding and performance. So as you are talking with the child and you're giving them feedback and they're adjusting their approach, and then you give more feedback and they ask questions, that eventually leads to students developing a greater understanding and performing better and attaining mastery on topics. And that's what we're looking for. Another reason why feedback is important is that it engages students in goal setting, task planning, monitoring, self-reflection, and those kinds of executive functioning activities that help develop self-regulated learners. We really want the children to be able to reflect on what was said, to take it in, to synthesize that information and integrate it, and then, take action based upon the feedback that was received. And through that entire process, it is going to result in children who are more independent and self-directed. So and if you are working in a Montessori environment, this is this is the name of the game for us. This is one of the most important things that we're trying to accomplish, is developing self-directed learners in our environments. So let's talk about some examples of feedback, because, you know, a lot of people think of feedback as being something that's evaluative or judgmental, but feedback is very descriptive and it's based upon observation. So the comments are not necessarily positive or negative, they're very neutral. They're very noticing statements, observing statements. So you are being very clear and descriptive about what you see and what's happening. So here's a few examples of feedback. So if a friend says, "When I was upset the other day, you said a lot of things that made me feel better. Your words were very comforting to me. Thank you so much." You know, that's some great feedback. That's me hearing, if somebody says that to me, that I used some specific words that were very comforting to this person. And, you know, that's much more descriptive than somebody saying, "I like you because you're always nice to me." And, you know, saying somebody's nice is very general, but you know, saying when I was upset the other day, you said a lot of things that made me feel better and your words were very comforting. That is very specific feedback. Another example would be, I'm a person who likes to write a lot of blogs and articles, and so that's fun for me. And so if a colleague edits my blog post and says, "You know, your writing was really compelling and it kept my full attention, except towards the end, you didn't really share any short stories for examples about what you were talking about like you did earlier in your writing." When you share those stories and examples, it makes your content more relatable to the audience and more interesting. So I recommend that you make sure that you are continuing to provide examples via the stories and experiences that you've had in order to demonstrate what you're talking about. So that is very specific feedback, very specific. Another one for any of you athletes who are out there, you can, maybe a baseball coach will say to you, "Every time you swung the bat and missed, you didn't have your eye on the ball. However, on the one that you hit way out into the outfield, you kept your head down and your eye was on the ball." So, you know, that is some very specific feedback to a baseball player to keep their head down. Instead of like, you know, "Oh, you know, you seem like you are having a hard time hitting the ball," or whatever. You know, that's very general feedback. You want to get specific about it. So with that in mind, we're going to get a little more detailed about talking about some keys to effective feedback. So feedback should be goal-oriented. So a person has a goal, they take action to achieve that goal, and then receives goal-related information about their actions. In school, learners are often unclear about the specific goal or task or a lesson that they have. So it's really important to remind them about the goal and the criteria by which that they are self-assessing. So that's a really important thing for them to do, is that they, you know, it has to be goal-oriented. Like that they need to understand, like, what is the outcome that's expected here? What is the goal? If they don't know what the goal is, that then for the feedback, and then it's not going to be very helpful. So effective feedback is also transparent. So, you know, students don't want to feel like they're guessing. They want to know what to expect at the outset. They want to know what the expectations are, because it's really easier to process feedback if they know what the expectations are ahead of time. You know, as a teacher, I might even say something like, you know, we're going to be doing a lesson on transitioning between paragraphs. And so we're going to be looking at transitions between paragraphs and also including important details in this writing, which is something we talked about last week. And we're going to be giving each other feedback on that after we're finished with the lesson. So if you let them know what the expectation is and that you guys are going to be giving and receiving feedback, they're going to be much more receptive to the feedback. If the feedback comes without them knowing it's coming, and also not knowing exactly what the expectations are so that they can get the kind of feedback that's going to be helpful for them, then that's going to cause them to be frustrated. They want to know, this is what I'm looking for as a teacher. You know, they want to hear you say, this is what I'm looking for. This is what I'm thinking about. You could also create with the children or with other teachers. If you have like a teaching team, you can create rubrics with them that you can create rubrics with the teachers, like in a teacher team, or you can create some sort of a rubric or a list of expectations with the students that they can reference that will be helpful for them. You also want to make sure that your feedback is actionable. This is really important, because why do we give feedback if there's not going to be an action that is correlated with that feedback? Otherwise, it's kind of like when a parent says something like, oh, you never put your toys away, you're so lazy. Instead of saying, will you please go put your toys away? Or you need to put your toys away before we come to dinner. So, you know, the first way, they are sort of shaming the child without changing any behavior. And the second and third ways I just mentioned, there is specific action required. And it's the same with feedback. It needs to be actionable. Great feedback elicits an action or a response from students. It provides a clear course of action for next time, or outlines a new plan for moving forward. They should know what to do next after feedback is given. They need to know, what are those expectations? What can I do next? And what action can they take? That's really important and you also, before you give the feedback, as a teacher, you need to think about what the action items might be. You know, and it's usually involves with elementary children. They're going to do some more repetition. They might need to have a lesson retaught. They might need some additional practice. They might be partnering with a peer who has some experience in this area. So there's a lot of different things that can happen, a lot of action items that you can do, but make sure that when you give feedback, that it is combined with them doing something about that feedback. Otherwise, you've really missed an opportunity. Another really important aspect of feedback is that it needs to be timely. So feedback is provided immediately, or at least within a couple of days of the work being completed. Now, there are times when it's better to wait. Like, obviously, if a person is giving a performance in front of an audience and they make a mistake, you're not going to jump up and give them feedback right away, right? You're going to wait till the right time. So timely doesn't necessarily mean right now. Usually timely in this sense will mean you want to do it as soon as possible, but what it really means is the right time. So you want to not wait too long, and you don't want to do it too soon either. You want to provide guidance to the child while the work that they've done or the activity that they've completed is still fresh in their minds. You know, you as a teacher are very busy, so it's sometimes hard to give timely feedback, and it's hard to give feedback to everybody all the time, but that's why you have a classroom of helpers, of fellow students. So you can use both peer feedback in assisting you in delivering that timely feedback. You can set up peer feedback situations, or technology. Some technology activities that children are engaged in, particularly if you are doing distance learning. I'm in the United States, and we just heard today that we are going into distance learning for the fall once again. So that is something that's coming up. And so, you know, you might be using technology as a tool for feedback, and that can be a useful and helpful tool for you as a teacher. and for the student as well. Feedback needs to be ongoing. So the more feedback that a student receives, the greater their performance is going to be. So video games actually work like this. So you're playing your game, your video game, and then you fail or die or whatever happens in your video game. And then you can immediately start over. And then sometimes you even start over in the exact same place where you left off, and you get to try again. So it's like a continuous feedback loop. So a video game is actually a very good example of ongoing feedback, and it's a very continuous feedback loop. So we want to make sure that we are giving the children ongoing feedback as well, because the more feedback that they receive, the greater that their performance and their learning will be. Feedback also needs to be consistent. So information needs to be stable, accurate, and trustworthy. And, you know, coming from you as the teacher, you need to be a trustworthy component in this as well. You also need to be teaching the children in your classroom, when they're giving and receiving feedback to each other, that their feedback also needs to be consistent. And this is something that you can work on with your students to teach them how to give and receive feedback. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So groups of teachers or even students and teachers can come together and define what quality work looks like, so that you have a consistent rubric or consistent expectations outlined, so that they know this is, you know, what is generally expected for this age level and this age level and this particular area, and that's really important. So let's talk about how to give actionable feedback. So you need to know why you're giving them feedback. And I mean, why are you giving them feedback? And they need to know why you're giving them feedback too. And it's really important that you set a climate of safety around this, because you are giving them feedback in order to improve their performance. However, some children might come from a home situation where they associate feedback with criticism, or they associate feedback with judgment. And you're going to have to be careful, and you're going to notice those children pretty quickly, because you're going to see they have some sensitivity around feedback that you're going to have to help them overcome. And that's going to be by building a climate of safety and trust. You are also going to want to prepare for your feedback conversations. You're going to want to think about, what do I need to address in this conversation? What outcome do you want? And what topics do not need to be brought up? So you need to be very specific and laser focused on what your conversation is going to look like when you are giving feedback. You also want to be specific. So you don't want to provide feedback that raises more questions than it answers. For example, you don't want to, you know, say something like, okay, you need to do a better job next time. That didn't work out very well, you know, or you did a sloppy job or something, which hopefully as a teacher you wouldn't say. But those are examples of very general feedback. Like, you know, if somebody tells me I didn't do a good job or it was sloppy, like, what does that mean? What does that look like? It's kind of like when parents will tell a child who's a big picture thinker, go clean your room. Well, a child who's not a detail-oriented person, they get overwhelmed by that. And they're like, what does that mean, clean my room? So myself as a parent, when my younger daughter was a child who is a big picture thinker and tends towards less order, I guess you could say, when she was a child, I would have to say, it's time to clean your room. And that means you need to put your stuffed animals in the basket, vacuum your room, your floor, make your bed, and put your toys back on your shelf. So that is very specific feedback, and it was very actionable as well. So instead of, as a teacher, instead of saying something like, you need to do a better job next time, or, you know, this wasn't quite what I was thinking about when I was imagining you doing this, you can say, can you please add details to your story and maybe some transitions between your paragraphs and order the events in your story so that they are in a sequence? So there you are, giving them, like, they know what to do then. So you know, you're being very clear about what you're asking and what you need and what they need and what is needed. So as I kind of touched upon earlier, feedback needs to be presented carefully, very delicately, and gently. Again, as I said earlier, there are some children who come from families where feedback is associated with something negative. And when they receive feedback, they feel bad, they feel shame, they feel wrong. And you're going to need to overcome those hurdles if you're going to create a classroom culture where giving and receiving feedback is a regular part of everybody's day. So the way feedback is presented can have an impact on how it is received. I find, generally speaking, that giving feedback in terms of questions and having them kind of come up with some ideas and leading them to do it is really a great strategy for the children who are very sensitive about that kind of thing, but even a regular child. So if I was having a conference with a child, instead of saying, oh, you know, I see that your quotations in dialogue are missing, and I see that there's the transitions, you know, need to be smoother, and the sequence of events is a little unclear. You can ask them, you know, why don't you read through this and see, is there anything that any kind of punctuation that you think might be missing? You know, what about when the people are talking? What is needed there? Oh, quotation marks. Yeah. Okay. So the feedback I would give you is to make sure that you are putting quotations whenever dialogue is happening. So you're kind of having a very meaningful dialogue, and the child is participating in that dialogue and becoming part of the feedback process. If feedback is not received well, it can really lead to a reduction in the learner's motivation. That's why you have to be so careful that your feedback does not come across as judgment, because there's nothing more demotivating to a learner is when they feel judged or controlled or scrutinized. They're not going to be receptive and responsive to feedback. Feedback also needs to be very objective and specific, and as I mentioned earlier, without evaluation or judgment. And feedback can be counterproductive if the student is feeling too closely monitored, like if they feel like that you're just like on top of them and you're watching them the whole time. It can also be counterproductive if the students are interpreting your feedback as a way that you're trying to control them. There are children who are more sensitive to control than others. Sometimes it's because they had more control at home, and so they're bristling at that right now. So you're going to have to watch out for that. And also watch out when you're giving feedback that you're being just very transparent and open, and that you don't have an agenda. If you come in with your feedback as, my agenda is this child has something wrong with them and I am here to fix it, they're going to feel that. If you have the agenda of, I'm here to help you and support you as you're learning and growing, they're going to feel that too. So you need to think about what is your mindset as you're stepping into the feedback process. Feedback also can backfire if students feel that they are in competition with their peers. So, you know, when I was a younger person in school, in traditional school, there was much more of a focus on children competing with each other and people winning and things like that. I don't see that as common as much even in traditional settings, but it still does occur. You don't want the children to feel like that they are in competition with each other. So really resisting comparing children out loud and or having comparing their work, comparing each other. Sometimes when I have done some writing, I've wanted to get children to elevate the quality of their work. I have had them do some look at and review writing samples from other students, but I make sure that I either get those off of the internet, so they are not children that they know, or it would be previous children's work that from a few years back who I had photocopied, and maybe it would be somebody they might have known, and I might like block out the name so they don't see that, because I'm not going to have them compare their work to other people in the classroom or hold up somebody's work in the classroom as like, this is a shining example, because that lends to a sense of competition. But if you pull something off the internet and say, oh, this is a student who lives, in the United States, and it's a sample of some work that they did that I pulled off that I wanted you guys to look at, and we were going to go through and talk about it and see what aspects of this we feel are strong and what we would want to change. So, that's a better way of doing feedback, so that there's not like a competition set up, because you want to set up a climate of safety if you're going to have feedback happening in the classroom. So let's talk about improving feedback practices in your classroom. So when you're giving feedback on student work, it's really important to look at quality over quantity. This means you want to give the students thoughtful, constructive, appropriate feedback on a few pieces of work, rather than, just a very minimal feedback on lots of work. You don't have to be marking up or talking about or conferencing about every single piece of work that a child is doing, because that can get overwhelming. I know that when I was teaching, like a lot of children would write, and they would write little reports and things like that. And I didn't ask them to revise every single thing they wrote, but I would say, I would like once a week or once every 2 weeks, I would say, okay, pick one of your favorite pieces and let's revise it. And then I would give feedback on that. It's not like they have to have feedback on every single thing that they do all the time. You really want it to be more in-depth feedback with a few pieces than, shallow feedback on many things. You also want to, I know I've said this a few different times and in a few different ways, but you really want to be descriptive in your language and objective, and you want to refrain from any sort of evaluation or advice. You may choose to do that on occasion, but you need to be conscious of it and be very careful when you do. And again, a great way of doing that, instead of while you're doing feedback, is asking them questions and having them come to the conclusions, and then sort of recapping the feedback that you guys are creating together. So you can really do it as a collaboration. You also want to take into account student beliefs and assumptions about themselves as learners. So you're going to have some students who feel very good about themselves, whether they have families who really gave them an elevated sense of self-esteem, or maybe they just are naturally more inclined that way. And then you're going to have some children who feel not so good about themselves as learners. And so you're going to need to really take into account their beliefs about themselves when you're giving feedback. And so that means that you're going to maybe need to be a little more sensitive and delicate to the children whose self-esteem is not as strong. You'll also want to tie feedback into student effort rather than student ability. So if you give them feedback and they're feeling kind of frustrated, or they feel like they're missing the mark, just say, you know what, just try again. As you keep trying and keep practicing, it gets easier over time. Saying something like that, as opposed to, oh, I know that you really have a natural knack for language arts, but math is hard for you. But we're just going to try to do this anyway. That's going to, put the child in a fixed mindset rather than a growth mindset. And we don't really want to have that happen. So make sure that you are taking into account the fact that that you're talking to them about student effort rather than their ability. Another thing you're going to want to do is foster a classroom culture that welcomes errors and corrective feedback. You want to create a climate of safety, and you want to point out benefits of feedback in their learning. So this is really important. I think this is the most important thing you can do, is use the word feedback and say, you know, we're going to be giving and receiving feedback to each other in the classroom. And this does not mean that we are saying that, you know, somebody is good or bad or right or wrong. We're just giving some thoughts about work, and we're going to adjust according to feedback. And you know, one of the neatest thing that you can do as a teacher, and I didn't do this as a teacher because I read a book and learned about it many years later, but if I was teaching in the class right now, I would definitely do this. And it also works well for administrators too, is that if you are the teacher, that you ask the children to give you feedback on things. So if they see that you are receptive to their feedback and you're receiving feedback and you're taking note of it and reflecting and adjusting your own approach around things, that is going to be such an amazing, transformative experience in your classroom, and do probably more to create a climate of safety than anything you could say or do, because you are actually modeling receiving feedback. So that's a really important thing that I think that you want to consider doing. You also want to give students ownership over their own learning. So when students have autonomy and control, and they feel accountable for their learning, they're more receptive to seeking, accepting, and using feedback for information. So in personalized learning environments such as Montessori, we see that this is a really important aspect of our pedagogical approach, is that we want to make sure that students are having autonomy and control, that they are having choice. And when they do have choice, they're going to be much more receptive to feedback. If you are controlling and micromanaging all of their learning experience, they're not going to feel good about themselves or their work, and they're not going to have the same kind of pride. And so when the feedback comes, it's going to feel more like you are telling them that they did something wrong. So you want to really make sure that you're giving your students ownership and choice. You know, and I actually just mentioned this earlier, but you want to give everyone in the classroom the opportunity to give and receive feedback. I just mentioned it in the context of being you as the teacher receiving feedback, but you want to make sure that the children are giving and receiving feedback to each other as well. So this is not a process where you are just giving a child feedback and then they're taking that information, integrating it, learning, applying it, readjusting, and doing. It doesn't go one way like that. It can be a very much of a dialogue and a partnership when you're asking them questions so they're finding it out. But also, I can receive feedback from the children, and the children can give and receive feedback to each other. And that's such an important aspect in an elementary classroom in particular, because the children are social beings, and we want to make sure that they're giving each other the opportunity to give and receive feedback, and that they learn how to give feedback kindly and constructively, and that they are also learning how to receive feedback without taking it personally and making it about them as being bad or wrong or whatever. So more sources of feedback mean more timely feedback is given, received, and applied. So the students can really be taught to give feedback with each other, for each other, especially because you as the teacher, you're very busy and you don't always want to be the one who's giving the feedback. And the feedback can even be like, you know, if the children are coming up to you and saying, you know, so-and-so's taking all of the pencils and putting them in their cubby, and there's no more pencils in the basket for the rest of us to use. You know, you can go and say, you know, why don't you give the child who's doing that some feedback about that? Go up to them and say, hey, I noticed that all of these pencils are in your cubby and there's no pencils left in the basket. And if we don't have those in there, then we can't, then a lot of us can't do our work if we can't find pencils in the pencil basket. So again, that is feedback. It's not academic feedback, but that is like the beginning stages of children giving each other feedback. And so this is something you're going to want to have them practice. And you know, elementary children are social scientists. They're figuring out how to negotiate, discuss, and collaborate. And so these are beginning opportunities of giving and receiving feedback that I think are a really wonderful thing to do. Okay, so let's talk about a few ways in which you can make peer feedback effective. So you could use some sort of a feedback rubric to help students learn how to give kind, accurate, specific, and constructive feedback. And you can even co-create these rubrics with your students. So, you know, you can give them specific phrases for feedback that they can use and under certain circumstances. Like, here are some examples of feedback you can give on writing assignments. Here's an example of feedback you can give when somebody is not being a responsible community member. You know, there's lots of different things that you want to model, like different ways that they can give feedback, because a lot of times elementary children it's referred to as the age of rudeness, because they're very blunt about what they're saying because they haven't refined those skills yet. So giving feedback giving and receiving feedback with you is going to be a little bit maybe more comfortable at times than an elementary child who, you know, if you have two elementary children who are younger and learning how to refine what they're saying in a way that doesn't come across as rude or unkind, you know, that takes some practice and skill to learn. Another really great idea is to make feedback processes anonymous. So, you know, students will tend to write more detailed feedback when it's anonymous, or even just offer feedback at all. We would have, in my class, we would have like a weekly meeting where we would talk about different things happening at school. And we actually had a little jar where people could put in concerns or appreciations or things like that. And so a lot of those concern slips were little pieces of feedback. And so it was a great way for people to be anonymous. And it was also, sometimes they were not very skilled. And so when I would read the piece of feedback, I would read it a little bit differently sometimes, that is in a more refined way, so the person who's hearing it can hear it in a better way. And that would also model to the child who wrote it a slight shift in what was said that can help them become more nuanced in their speech. You also want to moderate and review feedback from students. You might want to read some exchanges between students, or if they're giving each other oral feedback in a lesson, you're sitting there and you're offering your own perspective as a counterpoint and making sure that the feedback doesn't get out of hand. Because again, you know, it can devolve into evaluations or judgments with children if they haven't had enough practice giving feedback in a way that's more objective and based on observation. So yeah. Also, another fun thing you can do is ask students to react to the feedback that they receive. So in other words, they can give feedback about their feedback, you know? So what did you think about his response to your feedback? What did you think about her response to your feedback? And that's a really neat thing for them to do. I think it's maybe what one would call a metacognitive strategy. So that's something you can do. So here, I'm going to give a couple of examples, or a few examples of some questions you could have in a rubric if you're doing feedback, like maybe when you're doing a writing lesson and you're doing some feedback along with that. You know, maybe you had a group of children, they did a writing lesson, you had them do some sort of a writing assignment with that lesson. And then you bring them back together later on, and you can say, you know, maybe you'll have a list of questions, and one of them says, find 3 places where grammar or punctuation is incorrect. Explain why it is incorrect and show how it can be written correctly. So then they can write a little paragraph about what they see, or they could just, you know, if you have some sort of a trust situation set up, they can write on each other's paper, but it's kind of depends on what your situation is there. You can also ask, you know, which paragraph do you think is the most descriptive in this essay, and why do you feel that way? What part of this essay could use more detail? Is there any part of the report that needs further explanation or clarification in order for you to have a greater understanding of the topic? So you can, you know, these are just a few examples of questions that you could use for feedback that children can do when they're giving feedback and practicing the art of giving feedback. So there's many more. I'm sure you could probably Google a lot and do a search, an internet search. So last thing is we want to talk about ineffective feedback to avoid. So you want to avoid marks or grades as feedback. Again, you might work at a school or have some sort of a situation set up where you are marking papers or giving grades. I don't know. In the school settings I've been in, I haven't been doing that, but I know some people do have to do that. And if you're doing that because you need to do that, that's fine, but that's not feedback. That's you giving a grade, and a grade is really not feedback. It just says what somebody did right and what somebody did wrong, or that somebody did something right and somebody did something wrong. It doesn't actually tell you what a lot of times, you know, sometimes it's not very clear. So using marks and grades for feedback is not a very effective strategy because it's not clear, and it's very vague, and the children often don't know or understand like what they did, you know, right or wrong, and what needs to be adjusted in order to do better next time. So you really want to make sure to, if you're doing some sort of a marking system, that you are also coupling that with verbal feedback via student conferencing or checking in with them periodically. Another ineffective feedback to avoid, and this is something that's very, that all Montessorians worldwide would agree upon as something we don't use in our approach, is extrinsic rewards. So you're going to want to stay away from giving extrinsic rewards as feedback, because research has shown that when you give rewards to children, they will stop doing whatever it is you're rewarding them for once it's taken away. Or they may not stop doing it, but they will be very uninspired and uninterested and resistant to doing it, because they're like, well, I got a reward at first and now I'm not getting one. And the other thing about extrinsic rewards is that you have to keep making that extrinsic reward better and better and better, because you might be giving a little sticker and then eventually they get tired of stickers and it's not effective. So you need to give them a piece of candy, and then you're giving them a pencil, and you know, and so the effect of extrinsic rewards does not work. So that's a very ineffective way of feedback. Feedback really, the best and most effective feedback is verbal feedback by way of a dialogue. And the next, I would say, best strategy would be a written summary of some sort. So, you know, verbal or written feedback is important. Another piece of ineffective feedback to avoid would be student comparison. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but when you compare students to each other, it can be very demotivating to the children, and it can also set up a climate of mistrust and a climate of competitiveness in the classroom rather than collaboration and connection. you want to think, am I creating an environment of collaboration and connection, or am I creating an environment of competition and mistrust? And you have to think about that with everything you do, for sure, but particularly when you're giving feedback. So I actually went and observed in a classroom one time, and I've had a lot of times to observe in different classrooms, traditional schools, Montessori schools, Waldorf schools, all sorts of schools. And a teacher actually held up a child's painting or drawing that they did. They did some sort of an art lesson. And she held it up. This child was 6 years old, and she says, "Does anybody want to evaluate this?" And I was like shocked, because that does not set up a good moment for that. So I was observing in there before I was actually taking over at some point. And so I noticed that the children in that classroom were a little bit nervous about performing well, because they were worried about an evaluation. And over time, when they realized that that wasn't going to be a regular situation in their lives in the future, and then they slowly became much more comfortable taking risks. So anyway, you need to make sure you're not comparing students for feedback. You can compare students with themselves. A really great thing to do is have them get their portfolio out, and their student portfolio, their body of work, and have them look at, you know, from the beginning of the year till now, and see how far they've come. And then they can, again, they can do sort of like a self-assessment and self-feedback. You're also, again, you do not want to be giving non-specific feedback. To be very vague and unclear is not helpful to children. It does not help them improve. But what it does do is cause you to be frustrated, because I think a lot of times teachers don't realize that they're giving feedback that is not clear and descriptive to the children, because we have what's in our mind, and sometimes what's in our mind does not come out in a way that we thought that it did, or that we were pretty sure we had said. You know, that doesn't always happen. So it's really, really important that you give very specific feedback, and you're not gray, that you're like, oh, well, you know, the tone in this story is a little off. Well, what does that mean? The tone is a little off. You know, I'm a little concerned about this essay that you wrote about, and I'm not sure it's quite what we were talking about earlier. Well, that doesn't really give any specific information. You're kind of making the kid feel bad when you say that, but you're not saying, you know, hey, remember we talked about when we were writing these essays that we had to make sure that, you know, that you were struggling with remembering to capitalize your proper and common nouns, and also putting your quotations in dialogue. So let's remember to do that next time. So that is much better than something really vague. Another thing that you really want to avoid is giving them too much feedback at once. It can be overwhelming if you pull over an essay that they did and you're like, okay, I see that your punctuation is off, your capitals are off, your transitions, you're not indenting in your paragraphs. You know, there's a sequence that's out of order. That can be really overwhelming for children. So, you know, you might want to just take one or two pieces in there at a time and focus on them. I would start with just one thing at a time. And, you know, another thing to do is, another way that we do feedback in Montessori is not even giving specific feedback verbally in that moment, but we get the feedback that, okay, this child is having a hard time with capitalization and commas. Okay, so I'm going to give this child a lesson on commas, you know, so that's another way that you can go about doing it. But what you don't want to do is overwhelm them with, okay, you know, you need to work on this, you need to work on this, you need to work on this. They're not going to remember all of that, and
going to feel overwhelmed. So just try one thing at a time for your younger elementary children. You might be able to hit on 2 things if they're older, but don't do more than that in one sitting. Just let them practice, you know, little bits at a time so that they feel successful. And as they become successful in one area that you realize they were struggling with, then you're going to go to the next area. So, you know, just take it little bits at a time. Another thing that you're going to want to do is you want to avoid giving feedback when students lack knowledge or understanding. So this is actually a bit of a tricky piece here, because you may have given a lesson to a child, but you didn't realize that they didn't actually understand what was happening. So what you don't need to give them is feedback. What you need to do is reteach the lesson entirely. So that's a little bit different than feedback, although it's feedback for you. It's good feedback that you need to reteach that lesson. But if the child doesn't understand a concept or a skill that you have taught, then it's really important that you make sure that you are not giving them feedback in those areas, because it's not helpful to the child. They're not going to retain that feedback if they didn't retain the concept, because those 2 things kind of go hand in hand. In fact, it'll probably cause the child to be a little more confused even, and that can be really challenging. So one little last thing to kind of bring in here is, you know, let's talk about ways that you can help your classroom become comfortable with accepting and giving feedback. You can start out at the beginning of the school year in a community meeting and say, okay, class, we are going to be developing a practice this year on giving and receiving feedback. And this is what feedback is. This is what it looks like. And let me do a role play for you right now. So maybe if you have an assistant teacher and you guys can role play giving and receiving feedback, and then you can have a couple of children come up and role play giving and receiving feedback, and brainstorm with them, what are the conditions we need to have in this classroom to develop a sense of safety and trust, so that when I give you some feedback, that you feel comfortable and that you will take it as information that can help you learn and grow, and instead of taking it personally that there's something wrong or something is bad. And so just having a very explicit conversation with your classroom will go a really long way. So make sure that the feedback that you're giving is timely and clear and concise and actionable. And then you're going to be going a long way in helping the children really learn and understand and retain concepts. And it's also going to help you inform your further instruction, because you're going to be giving feedback, they're going to be applying it. You're going to be checking in with them, then you're going to be adjusting and they'll be adjusting. So it's a very beautiful process. It's almost like a bit of a dialogue, only there's action and dialogue and all sorts of things. And it's really one of the most powerful formative assessment tools that you can use. And not only is it great for formative assessment, but giving and receiving feedback can really go a long way in building relationships between you and the students in your classroom. So thank you very much for coming to this webinar on formative assessment when it comes to providing effective, detailed, and actionable feedback to your students.